Hello, my name is Rodney Siegel, and I'll be talking today about the effects of the changing fire regime on selected priority bird species in the Sierra Nevada, where I conduct most of my research, along with colleagues at the Institute for Bird Populations and many other agencies and institutions. This is an image of the aftermath of the 2018 Camp Fire, which devastated the town of Paradise. Before talking about birds, I just want to recognize at the outset that the changing fire regime has very real consequences for people, and that irrespective of anything I say about the habitat needs of birds, protecting human life is paramount when we think about management of fire and fire risk. Propelled by climate change and a legacy of fire suppression, fire is now on the march in the Sierra. The fire season is lengthening, and fires are burning larger areas, often at higher severity. The two largest wildfires in the recorded history of the region, the Creek Fire and the North Complex Fire, both burned in 2020, and 8 of the 10 largest fires all burned since 2012. The intensified fire regime is reshaping our forest landscape with consequences for wildlife that, for the most part, are not very well understood. Nevertheless, for birds at least, there is quite a bit we do know that may help guide forest management strategies. Forest birds are ecologically diverse, with some species relying on habitat elements like abundant snags and open canopies that are created or maintained by fire, and others relying more heavily on later sierra forest characteristics like big trees and closed canopy cover. Much of our land and forest management is built around the perceived needs of designated priority species, and for that reason, I want to focus today on 4 such priority bird species. Although I can't summarize all the relevant research findings on these 4 species today, for each, I'll just highlight some recent findings that may indicate vulnerability or resilience to the changing fire regime and identify some general management implications. In the American West, blackback woodpecker is more strongly associated with burned forests than any other bird species. Blackback woodpeckers colonize recently burned forest where they excavate nest cavities in burned trees. They forage on the superabundant larvae of wood-boring beetles that also colonize recently burned forests. After 5 to 10 years, the beetle populations decline and the woodpeckers become scarce or absent. Here in California, the species is far more abundant in recently burned conifer forest than any other habitat. Given the increases in fire activity that we're discussing today, you might wonder why this fire-loving species even merits any concern right now. The answer is that the species remains uncommon in California, and it relies largely on an ephemeral and patchy habitat, recently burned forest, that land managers actively try to prevent from developing, and when it is created, often work hard to transform and replace as quickly as possible. Based on the blackback woodpecker's known life history characteristics, until recently, many of us thought ideal habitat for them in California looked something like this, with vast tracts of fire-killed trees representing continuous habitat. But our more recent research has substantially changed this understanding. We were surprised that 2 recent megafires in the Sierra were only very lightly colonized by blackback woodpeckers, despite appearing to have vast amounts of good habitat. To figure out why, we tagged young and adult woodpeckers and studied their movements, habitat use, and survival. We discovered that young woodpeckers, unlike adults, rely heavily on live trees for cover from predators. After fledging from their nests in high burn severity forest patches, shown here in red, they make a beeline for nearby unburned or low severity burn patches, shown here in white, where they hunker down for weeks, being fed by their parents, who continue to forage on dead trees in nearby patches of burned forest that burned at mixed or high severity. The presence of nearby live trees positively affects habitat selection for nesting as well as foraging, and even increases fledgling survival. So even this flagship species for burned forest has a much more nuanced relationship to fire than we thought. This is not to suggest that blackback woodpeckers aren't fire-loving. They preferentially nest and forage in high severity burns, but they do best where there are also nearby patches of live trees. Ongoing changes to the fire regime throughout the region may therefore render many newly burned areas less hospitable to the woodpeckers if overall biodiversity, the variation in fire characteristics, is reduced. To maximize the value of burned forests for black-backed woodpeckers, the most important thing is to protect habitat values within burned forests. That means retaining substantial amounts of burned forest on the landscape wherever feasible, which will also benefit many other bird species that thrive in burned areas. When post-fire logging does occur, for black-backed woodpeckers, we should prioritize retention of burned stands that are close to the perimeter of the burned area, rather than deep in the interior. And lastly, and most generally, we need to try to figure out how to manage landscapes to promote biodiversity, which will yield more of the habitat heterogeneity the woodpeckers need after future fires. Now let's turn attention to a bird species of conservation concern that at first blush might seem likely to be much less tolerant of fire, the great gray owl. Great gray owl is a California endangered species with likely well under 200 pairs breeding in California and a very limited distribution in the state. The owls forage on rodents, primarily in mid-elevation meadows, and nest nearby in adjacent forest. They need large trees for nesting and dense forest cover to shade their nests. Fire, because it can consume these habitat features, is believed to be a major threat to several forest nesting birds of prey in California, including great gray owl. And the owl could be especially vulnerable due to its need for a relatively rare constellation of habitat features that may be threatened by fire. Large trees and older, well-shaded forest stands directly adjacent to mid-elevation meadows. In 2013, the rimfire tested just how vulnerable to fire the owls really are. The rimfire burned like a bullseye in the heart of great gray owl's range in California. The burned area encompassed at least 23 known breeding sites on Stanislaus National Forest and Yosemite National Park, raising concerns about the local persistence of the species. However, survey data collated from multiple partners at sites in and near the burned area before and after the fire revealed that, at least in the 3 years after fire, the owls proved quite resilient, still occupying nearly all previously occupied sites within the burned area, with anecdotal information suggesting widespread nesting. In fact, occupancy at both the burned and unburned sites actually increased after the fire. The fire clearly did not negatively affect occupancy in the short term, although we don't yet have any longer term data. Late Cyril conifer forest, adjacent to appropriate meadows, is precious for great gray owls and must be protected everywhere it occurs. Based on our findings, development and human encroachment may be bigger risks than fire. Also, land managers need to keep in mind the standing crop over time of large snags around montane meadows, protecting large trees and snags through active management if necessary, and striving to recruit large trees that will be appropriate nesting structures many decades in the future. Lastly, even heavily burned home ranges may continue to serve as habitat for years after fire, so historically occupied great gray owl sites should still be managed as great gray owl habitat. Northern goshawk is another apex forest predator, but a diurnal one. In the Sierra Nevada, goshawks nest and forage in dense forest with late Cyril attributes, including large trees and closed canopy cover. Populations have declined across much of the West over the last century, as late Cyril forest attributes were lost to timber harvest. More recently, it's been suggested that loss of late Cyril forest to high severity wildfire may also be a grave threat to goshawk persistence in some areas. Colleagues and I recently tagged and tracked 20 northern goshawks on Plumas National Forest to better understand habitat selection, space use, and movement patterns. Overall, we confirmed selection for late Cyril forest attributes, including high canopy cover and large trees, and avoidance of high severity burned areas during both roosting and foraging. We also used an existing fire risk map to assess fire hazard potential across our study area and found high fire hazard potential areas overlapped with 80% of foraging space use and 87% of roost locations, substantially higher than for the overall landscape. The increasing wildfire risk thus appears to present substantial concern for the conservation of the goshawk population in the region. A big challenge, though, is that efforts to reduce the risk of high-severity fire, including forest thinning and prescribed fire, may also reduce goshawk foraging and roosting habitat quality to the extent that they decrease canopy cover and fragment and isolate late cereal forest. Another challenge is that just protecting habitat within protected activity centers, or PACs, which are intended primarily to protect nesting habitat, will likely not be sufficient. Our study of goshawk movements revealed that goshawks did only about 25% of their foraging and roosting within PACs. Taken together, these concerns seem to argue for concentrating fuels treatments in mid-cereal and young forest patches across the landscape, where they may reduce the risk of large-scale, high-severity wildfire in goshawk habitat without jeopardizing habitat quality around nest locations. Lastly, I want to focus briefly on the California spotted owl, which is probably now the most intensively studied bird species in the region, and certainly the most argued over. New papers assessing aspects of its relationships to fire and forest management continue to be produced at a fast clip by multiple research groups, including my own, and I don't have time to summarize them today. But the California spotted owl is believed to be vulnerable to the changing fire regime, largely for the same reasons as the northern goshawk. It selects later cereal, closed canopy forests for nesting and foraging, and these conditions have been diminished by historical logging and now appear to be increasingly jeopardized by the changing fire regime. In recent years, there's been much debate over whether California spotted owls are jeopardized more by fire or by forest thinning efforts intended to reduce the risk of fire. Most researchers in the arena seem to have settled on a middle ground that acknowledges that logging over the past century is probably the main factor that has driven population declines, but also that fire may nonetheless pose the greatest risks at present and into the future. This emerging synthesis also recognizes that fire is not uniformly destructive to the owls. Most studies, like this one that colleagues and I conducted in Yosemite after the rim fire, indicate that the owls are displaced when portions of their home range burn, when large portions of their home range burn at high severity, but they can continue to thrive after low or even mixed severity fire. The danger to spotted owls is thus not fire per se, but rather seems to be more specifically the large, homogeneously high severity fires that are occurring with greater frequency. So, spotted owl responses to fire vary. The birds appear to be vulnerable to some post-fire conditions, but resilient to others. More pyro-diverse landscapes with mixed severity fires rather than homogeneously high severity fires will be better able to support owls. Large-scale plans to thin and burn PACs and larger landscapes are already underway across much of the region, and we urgently need to study them to determine their efficacy. Summing this up, bigger, higher severity fires are not necessarily better for even the most fire-loving birds, and even the more fire-vulnerable species can be quite resilient to fire under the right circumstances. Rather than trying to eliminate fire or burn forests, which we can't do anyway, our best bet is to try to manage for pyro-diversity across the landscape, such that fire increases rather than decreases the overall habitat heterogeneity. However, forest with late cereal characteristics is already greatly reduced. Such forests should be protected or recruited wherever possible, acknowledging that active management to do so may present risks to wildlife and proceeding cautiously. When forest does burn, we also need to protect habitat value within burned landscapes, recognizing that these are not just wastelands, but rather they're valuable habitat for many bird species as well as other wildlife. Lastly, recent shifts in our thinking about fire effects on some priority bird species should give us a lot of humility. There is still a great deal that we don't know about the effects of fire on birds. And the fire regime shifts, as the fire regime shifts towards perhaps novel conditions, the uncertainty only grows. We therefore need to ensure that forest and fire management occurs in a context where we can learn from both successes and failures. Monitoring and research can be funded at a tiny incremental increase in cost, over forest treatment implementation and can reap big returns by informing the design of future efforts. And these substantial forest treatment projects should also be learning endeavors where we monitor outcomes for wildlife. Thanks for listening today.